like the New York school is bigger than, like I saw today this guy, I forget who it was, some fucking writer is writing a group biography of the New York school. John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, James Schuyler, Kenneth Koch, Barbara Guest, and Amiri Baraka. And I'm like, well, great. They already kind of did that. That David Lehman book is basically that. But it's like, that's not really the entirety of the New York school. There's this whole other thing that's really going unnoticed. Things like Bernadette Mayer, things like uh, Alice Notley, the tree of that going down, right? There's still a lot of the people who studied with Bernadette Mayer and Alice Notley in the East Village. Bob, all of them. Bob Holman, Tom Savage, Ann Waldman is still here. Ann Waldman is teaching people. Ann Waldman is teaching No Land. Ann Waldman is teaching all these like young people that sort of like go to Naropa or whatever. Not necessarily that makes them New York school or anything per se, but like uh to some degree, I think the New York school can't really exist because of just the fact that it's too expensive, right? Like the I think one of the principal uh like prerequisites for being New York school is you have to live in New York, right? I mean, to me, the work is reflective of the place very much. And the consciousness and the look and the sound of New York school is very much the product of this environment. And so just the fact that it's so goddamn expensive to live anywhere that those people lived in the East Village or in Chelsea, like there's a lot of people that live in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn is not the same as Manhattan. It's not as truncated, it's not as vertical, it's not as kind of smushed. And so uh in that sense, that's why I met those people I mentioned earlier that were mentioned in Marcella Duran's. It seems like that is the New York school. Those people live in Manhattan, like they've learned here. They're both local here, but they're also kind of like uh the thing about living in Manhattan is like it's a local place, but it's like the big dogs are here, right? And so you're existing in a way that's like local, but you're also like growing to be like an impressive proportion or whatever comparatively. Like I've just been thinking about that a lot. The proportions are just bigger here. The buildings are taller. Howard Stern, a lot of the people that I know that are poets are like super fucking. It's just like because it's the big fucking apple, it's the big pond. It's like it's where the super fucking predators are. It's where the super fucking unicorns are. And when I see the other poets and when I see those poets on that level, I'm like, they are just like faster, smarter, more, I don't know, put together in control, like innovative, whatever. It is hard to like be like fuck. I mean, to be at that level, but I also say that especially if you read the Get the Money book, Ted Berrigan mentions a lot. My friend Greg Masters, who was the editor of the newsletter and who lives in 437 East 12th Street, which is a kind of a, if you want to talk about the New York school, you can't, to my mind, you can't really talk about it without talking about that building. Not that a whole lot of New York school, trademark writers lived there per se. Larry Fagan lived there, Jim Brody lived there, Arthur Russell lived there, Rene Ricard lived there, Allen Ginsberg lived there, Richard Hell lives there, John Godfrey lives there. So it's kind of an essential New York school location. But is Greg officially in the New York school? I mean, if you ask the super academics or whatever, or the highest echelons of that, uh, the highest echelons of that are the ones that get kind of like studied. But Greg Masters is still here. John Godfrey is still here. He did a talk the other day with fucking Philip Marinovich. It's like, is Philip Marinovich in the New York school? Is Edmund Berrigan in the New York school? To some degree, I mean, that Alex Katz painting exhibit is a great example of everything that we're talking about, because Alex Katz is the kind of like artist biographer of the New York school, and all those paintings are of the poets of the New York school, and that moment did kind of happen and pass in the 60s and 70s. But if you go to the exhibit, they did a fucking opening ceremony, and Alex Katz is there. He's alive. He's drinking champagne. His son, Vincent Katz, is there. Greg is there. Anselm Berrigan is there. Like, that's the New York school, basically. I mean, it's not the 60s anymore, and a lot of those people are dead. I mean, Peter Sheldall just died. But Greg Masters spent a lot of time with Ted Berrigan, with Louis Warsh, with Bernadette Mayer. He published all of them. He interviewed Edwin Denby. He published James Schuyler, Alice Notley. He learned from all of them. He's lived a life in poetry. I mean, his work is not necessarily the most New York school per se. There are definitely a lot of elements of that. Talking about the neighborhood. I mean, particularly in these more recent poems where he's talking about history of the neighborhood and things. He draws from other places as well, though. He draws from objectivist, kind of William Carlos Williams, a lot of different places. So he's not necessarily like New York school in the same way that like Ted Berrigan is fucking New York school, or Frank O'Hara. He's not like 100% that kind of like formula or cliche, but it definitely is a part of his work, and he's a part of that tree. He's mentioned in the fucking Get the Money thing. Ted goes to his reading at the Poetry Project. He worked at the Poetry Project. I mean, the fact that the Poetry Project is still there, I think, is like says something about the New York school. It's a shame to me that the people who are in the New York school like deny that it exists, because it's such a the things that make something New York school, and this is why I think that it's worth champion. I think it's cool. Like, to me, if everything is branding and everything is like about the cool shit that happened in the 70s, or like selling New York and selling poetry and selling like, but also just like, I think the techniques and stuff, part of what drew me to New York school was like, it felt, particularly in the early 2010s, having just moved to New York, and seeing people go to brunch and just seeing like the way people lived in their little shorts with their hairy legs out, and going to Fire Island, and it seemed to me like Frank O'Hara, in social media in particular, it seemed to me like Frank O'Hara was the poet of the 2010s, and he predicted, like, I do this, I do that, and kind of like constant reportage, first person auto fiction, although that even was a little before that. But I mean, it's also just New York. I mean, it's like one of the hallmarks of the New York school is that it mentions fucking New York. It mentions like places in New York, streets in New York. Uh, fucking Frank O'Hara is like the fucking king of that, right? Like he's in Times Square. He's hailing a cab. He works at fucking MoMA. Like, uh, it's one of the things that they point to is the relationship between the poets and the painters. New York School, the painters went to a lot of the readings of the poets. They were friends. George Schneemann, who the fuck is the other guy? Philip Guston. Uh, I mean, even Jasper Johns at the Jasper Johns fucking exhibit, if you saw the sequence, he's got a page of the sonnets painted into the fucking, I forget what those poems or those paintings are, the big gray ones. Those big gray, I forget what the fuck, but the sonnets, like Jasper Johns was influenced by the sonnets and vice versa. They were all art critics. James Schuyler was an art critic for Art News. Ashbery was an art critic. Ted Berrigan was an art critic. Greg Masters was an art critic. He's got books that he published of art criticism. I mean, that was a job that you could get. Peter Sheldall, right, became an art critic for the New Yorker. He was the art critic at the New Yorker for like 30 or 40 fucking years, because to me, the New York school is about like the up to the utmost minute of contemporary presence. I think living in this environment, being surrounded by the speed of it, the cacophony of it, the incoherence of it. New York is like a physical metaphor or like embodiment of like the internet almost. It's almost like a real, just like the way everything is kind of crammed together and the kind of non sequiturness of it, and the overload of it, just like the sensory overload of it, the stimulation of it, the access of it, the way everything is kind of readily available. New York as a physical space is about as close to just like it feels like you're living in like the most contemporary reality, the most contemporary, but also I think that causes the style. For whatever reason, I do think New York City is just like this factory of like once again the unicorns, right? The best of the best. Like you come here, you have to do stuff like fast. You have to be a fucking genius. You have to be a technical genius. Like you got to look good. Like it's just like it kind of there's so much pressure that it just forces out like I don't know the inessential or something. And when I read New York school poets, I do feel like I'm getting just like the best version of poetry actually that I could. It's not victim. Ashbery says this thing. There's this interview between Kenneth Koch and John Ashbery where they talk about matters of taste, and Ashbery goes, "What other matters are there?" And so I think to some degree, like the New York school is about having like the best possible taste or something. Meaning just like, I don't know, even the way you write has like the best ideas, the most contemporary, like when you look at the second generation of the New York school, Ted Berrigan, Ron Padgett, Dick Gallup, Joe Brainerd, Lewis McAdams, you start to see pop art come into it in a bigger way. And that rock and roll, garage rock, the second generation of the New York school, the things that mark the poetry that the first generation has this kind of classical, kind of like highbrow refinement. That's what I mean by like best possible taste. Like there's this book that recently came out with like some playlists that John Ashbery made, and they're like it's like all this opera and like this music that's just like impossibly like European and like obscure and just like elegant, and like I've never even heard of any of it. And Frank O'Hara, it's kind of the same thing. They're going to see Balanchine, and like, there was some sense that they wanted to be like these Europeans or something. They wanted to be like Paris in the fucking 1900s or whatever. They wanted to be like Nijinsky or their references. I mean, they'll do lowbrow shit too, but like a lot of their aspiration feels like, I don't know, kind of hoity-toity, and like they were coming from like, they went to Harvard, and like the people they hung out with, Bobby Fisdale and these pianists, and like were sophisticated, like I don't know if they were like society people, but they were like, Virgil Thompson, or they were. Whereas like the second generation, the pop art thing kind of comes more into it. It's more about rock and roll. Ted Berrigan, their poems. He has a poem called Waterloo Sunset. Tambourine Life has kind of like an acid, kind of like garage rock, kind of Louie quality to it. I think that's why I vibe probably most with, I vibe with a lot of the art from that period. But there's a lot of like song, Ted Berrigan's second book is called In the Early Morning Rain. A lot of times you can tell they're listening to things on the radio, or there's kind of earworms in the air. So they'll mention music, pop music. There's like a cleanliness to it, right? Like Joe Brainerd, right? There's like, I Remember is like this formula. You can tell they're like in a more a Warhol space. There's like a simplicity to it, a clarity to it. Ron Padgett does that a lot, but there's like a cartoonishness to it. Ron Padgett's first book is called Great Balls of Fire, right? Jerry Lee Lewis song. And he mentions shit like Woody Woodpecker, and, they fill their poems with, but I don't know, like, there's also concurrently, like in the sonnets, you see an attempt to describe reality. They're constantly mentioning what time it is. It's 5:15 a.m. I'm going over the Williamsburg Bridge. I have Pepsi. This thing where Ted Berrigan says, put Pepsi in your poem. It's about putting reality in your poem. Poets want to deny, or they want to live in this kind of flowery, like, poet world where, like, they're not talking about, they don't want to date their poems, or they don't want to mention lowbrow shit or whatever. Whereas like putting Pepsi and donuts right in your poem, it's like that's the reality that he lived in. His body is heavy with poverty, starch, right? Is what he says. It killed him. His diet is what killed him. The donuts and his bad teeth and the Pepsi and the speed. I would say speed has a lot to do with it. Not the first generation so much, but like a lot of the poets of the second generation and third generation, speed really had a lot to do with why they wrote the way they wrote. Ted Berrigan in particular. I mean, you could expand that to just say drugs in general, but, the second generation I think you can read as like an analog to rock and roll. They had basically the same kind of arc through the 60s where they did LSD, and they smoked weed, and they were hippies, and they had group sex, and painted naked pictures of each other and shit. There's a social aspect of New York school poetry that I think is like one of the key things. Collaborating with painters, mentioning other poets by name, writing about each other, right? Um, and I think that once again, this is all presence. This is all about presence. It's all about like living in the moment, seeing what's actually here. We're not living in like some haiku ideal version of what natural reality is, which is kind of a denial. A lot of nature poetry wants to deny like the artificial, but the artificial is just as much a part of nature. And so putting Pepsi in your goddamn poem, or hot dogs or whatever, or having a Coke with you, right, is like it's almost like being a nature poet, but like you're writing about the modern world. I mean, New York, I think one of the prime facts of living here is it is like an almost completely artificial reality. Like there's this famous Frank O'Hara thing about like I can't even enjoy a blade of grass. Okay, had to paint from nature. I can't even enjoy a blade of grass without a subway handy. Yeah, right. Uh, John Updike calls New York skyscraper national park. That's how I think of it. To me, it is a natural environment. We are cliff dwellers. And I don't know. The New York school might be like tribal in a way. You know, there's like this kind of like family. There's all these families. There's the Berrigans, and there's Louis Warsh and Burnett Mayer, and there's Pat Paget and Ron Paget. They all have kids. They're all writing about their kids. That's cool. I mean, the community thing, that's a big part of it to me, but also the economics of it. The economics of it are not something, it's been talked about a little bit, but like, the way that the second generation of the New York school had this kind of like hippie, I've talked about it before, right? It was not about chasing prizes or institutional kind of, success. There was some purity to it, or I don't know. They didn't really compromise their style to write poems that, I don't know, maybe would have gotten them better jobs or something. The rent control thing, the East Village, the cheapness of it, living bohemian lifestyle, and making work, making institutions, making magazines. Mimeo is a huge part of New York school. Once again, like they were saying, that was sort of a choice. They could have maybe published in a better format, but they wanted to make Mimeo because it was immediate and it was simple. That's one thing I try to do with my books is like I'm following that example because like the emphasis is on the fucking words. You're supposed to see the images and like get all of that, get all the visual from like your mind. The book itself is almost like supposed to be plain or like because like you're supposed to see it all, and it's not supposed to distract or plant some idea in your head about what you're supposed to see. It's sort of meant to be as low stimulation as possible to give you more room to just focus on the fucking words. But people like the covers. They like book. I mean, this cover maybe not so much, but like, people, a lot of times they'll buy your book just because they see the cover and they're like, oh, they just want the cover. And that's not a bad thing. Once again, the marriage of visual and, ut pictura poesis, right? As is painting, so is poetry. That's, I feel like, one of the crux things of the New York school is like, because they're hanging out with painters, vibing with painters, collaborating, Larry Rivers and Frank O'Hara, right? Having sex, collaborating on Stones. Uh, like, there's a lot of examples of that, spending time with each other, overlapping with each other, visiting the painter in their studio, taking that, there, once again, it's like an Apollinaire thing, right? The relationship that the painters and the poets had in Paris. Like, they were sort of imitating that. Frank O'Hara was the Apollinaire of that kind of milieu. But yeah, I mean, it's like a live stream, a lot of it. New York School, I mean, particularly with Frank O'Hara stuff, it's almost like he's taking his phone out and live streaming on his lunch break while he goes and, like, he's talking to his followers on fucking TikTok or Instagram or something, like, while he goes and gets lunch. It's like, there, and once again, to me, it felt like it was incorporating things of the modern world. It was working at the modern speed. It's entertaining. It's funny. I would say being funny is one of, like, the hallmarks of the New York School. Not that it's exclusively that, but, like, there is maybe, like, a lightness or, like, I don't know. It's actually funny rather than, like, some kind of Billy Collins shit or, like, I don't know. To me, it's like the New York School is almost like a misnomer because it could be the American style. It's the most contemporary sort of, like, it actually feels like it reflects what our culture is and where our consciousness is more accurately than what they're teaching in most universities. Not that New York School doesn't have, like, complicated sentences or anything like this, but, like, I don't know. With some of it, there's, like, a plain spokenness, like Ted Berrigan stuff. It's just, like, a lot of times it's just like he's saying shit. War is shit, is one of the lines in his poem. It's 1968, and war is shit. It's like, that's just like him saying that. But he also has this, like, tenderness when he reads, and this kind of, like, emotional quality. Yeah, there's, like, a diary quality, a reportage quality, using, like, the bric-a-brac of daily life. Gosh. It's one of those things that, like, it's hard to pin down. I think that's one reason why they're constantly, like, referring to this relationship between the painters and the poets. It's like, it's abstract, but it's also figurative. Like, Ted Berrigan can jump back and forth. Like, the New York School painters, like Jane Freilich, or, the painters that Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, Fairfield Porter, and who's the other guy? They didn't abandon figure. They were, like, landscape painters, a lot of them. They'd paint their window and shit. The New York School, it's kind of the same. I mean, Schuyler is a landscape painter. He's a describer. He's a, they're not, but, Ashbery, some of it can go to language poetry kind of places, or, like, abstract places. The language as material, the surface, putting a lot of texture on the surface, putting a lot of color, primary color. Berrigan uses a lot of, like, colors. That's like a Wallace Stevens thing, I think. But, like, he'll use blue, green, he'll just throw colors into his poem. Because the surface of the poem is almost like the surface of a canvas. It's almost like impasto. It's almost like a Dubuffet or something, where there's, like, the language is almost like a material, or, just the kind of, like, the raw joy of, like, blue, green, red, having that in your poem. The simplicity of putting Pepsi in there. It's like, I think that's a painter thing, to put color and to use, Bernadette Mayer, other poets go further. Bill Berkson is almost like a proto language where he goes like almost fully abstract with a lot of his stuff. But there's still, the narrative is almost like in the perimeter of your vision or something. It's like a peripheral. Like there is a narrative, to a lot of this stuff, but they're not just like laying it like a Robert Frost thing is like really like narrating the fuck out of a narrative. Whereas like, the sonnets, there's kind of like an aleatory narrative in there if you really want to, to me that feels more like life. It's like it's one of these things where unlike a lot of poetry where it's like trying to go to some kind of like super like ripping your guts out. Like here's the poem about like how I got fucking molested or whatever. My fucking parents, my uncle, whatever, died or something. It's like, or my, it's always like digging for some kind of like, super, like screenwriting, like drama, like everything in our culture. It's like trying to like emphasize some kind of like violent extreme that's supposed to grab your attention. New York School feels like it's about the quotidian, right? Dailiness. This is a big thing in New York School. It's like dailiness, paying attention to just kind of like the mundane. But because that is actually a huge part of our consciousness and a huge part of our reality. To me, New York School is really about reality and what we actually see. And for some reason, I think living in New York and being around these people that are, up to the minute and highly intelligent. I mean, just to live in New York, you have to have good reflexes. Everybody here is, you don't see chaos with people like, crossing the street or cars like disobeying. Like people are very aware of space, time. It's just like, so I'm saying like in a greater way, it's just like, it just sharpens everything, And so the sense of presence, I mean, this is something that Philip Marinovich guy said in his talk the other day that really stayed. I mean, for some reason, he's like living in the absolute present, not like what you think is the present, which may have just been like something that's actually a trail behind, like living in what are you actually seeing? What is actually happening right now? I think the New York School stylistically like is writing in this way, and by paying attention to all this stuff, by being able to incorporate sort of a dream-like abstract poetics, like in the sonnets where half of it is sort of like, changing tenses, like this is, it's almost like Tender Buttons or something. It's like a Gertrude Stein kind of like it changes, but like it, because it's a cut up, right? And it's kind of expertly put together. There is a continuity, and the rhythm of it and the sound of it is actually kind of what carries it through. I mean, there's a lot of things that play into New York School that are not necessarily the things that are like the forefront. There's these kind of shadow like sound, right? Jazz, this was a big part of the milieu when all of those people started writing the beat thing, the Black Mountain thing. Like that all goes into Ted Berrigan's writing. Paul Blackburn, Joel Oppenheimer. These are not necessarily people that we would say are New York School, but they are. Like Joel Oppenheimer lived in the downtown. He was the first director of the Poetry Project. Literally, he was the first director, and he writes about New York. But he went to Black Mountain, and his style is kind of a Black Mountain style. But it's like the difference is really negligible. And like they all did readings together. Like I was saying, Joel Oppenheimer was the fucking director of the Poetry Project. It's like these walls are not really there. So to only talk about like the painter aspect of the fucking New York School or the idea of the language or the surface of the poem being the forefront. Well, it's also the way that it looks. It's a sense of internal rhyme. It's not like you're not going to see end rhyme a lot of the time. It's not it's iconoclastic maybe formally with, but not like in some kind of like, I don't know, in a simple way. It's almost like simplifying it or something. Um, but yeah, I mean, you can't, you know, to me, things like Patti Smith or Richard Hell or punk rock music in a certain way. I mean, Eileen Miles' first reading was at CBGB's, right? It was all a part of like what was going on in New York through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s at St. Mark's. Like these artists were all seeing each other. They were all responding to each other. You know, punk rock is very inspired by Mimeo culture. You know, Richard Hell, those guys were looking at what they were doing at the Poetry Project and the kind of impoverished approach to things, and like that informed their sort of like lo-fi no budget theater of cruelty or something, almost like aesthetic. And if you look at, there was this exhibit at White Columns, which I think is a gallery in the West Village, and like there were all these posters from all these readings and shit in the 70s. And if you look at the lineups, once again, these things are not partitioned. There was like a reading that had John Giorno and Fran Lebowitz and Joe Brainerd and like and Eileen and Penny Arcade, and it's like, you know, John Giorno is not necessarily through and through like a New York school poet. He doesn't do a lot of the kind of Frank O'Hara shit, but it's like he was friends with Ted Berrigan. He's in the fucking anthology. Um, like, Fran Lebowitz, right? Fran Lebowitz is talks a lot about New York, is social, is this sort of raconteur kind of almost like a Frank O'Hara figure, the way that they kind of navigate the social set and like are this kind of, they're famous for their like quips or their like repartee as much as like anything, and just like kind of like their presence. Like I would say Fran Lebowitz is definitely a poet and is living a poet life. And the fact that she doesn't write books, I think, is part of that. I mean, I think laziness is a big part of New York school. Having these rent control apartments, it's something Eileen Miles talks about. Having all this time to just like do nothing and allow things to develop, sort of let your poem, you can write one poem a day. You don't have to stress about it. It's an interesting, it's because it is a tough fucking thing to like pin down, right? Like what makes, and certain things about it do sound kind of stupid. Like, okay, what makes a New York school poem is like talking about New York or like talking about your friends. Like that sounds pretty fucking stupid. Or putting Pepsi in it. Like, sounds pretty dumb. It doesn't sound like it adds up to anything. But there's a lot of things, like I'm saying, there's a lot of things that are playing into the surface of how these writers write that are harder to pin down. They don't use commas, they don't use semicolons, they don't stop on the end of the line as much. Their sense of punctuation in things is more free. I'm not saying they don't use any punctuation, but like it's more informed by like modernism, or like they'll use YR to abbreviate shit. Certain of them will. I think they disavow the fact that there is a New York school because there are a lot of stylistic variations within the New York school. Like the way that Bernadette Mayer writes is very different than the way that Alice Notley writes, which is very different than the way that Anne Waldman writes. But they're all New York school writers, and they're the things that they share, I would say, once again, are like the social aspect, maybe a certain chattiness, writing like how you talk, or like maybe a certain kind of like irreverence in tone, maybe even. You know, like I'm going to talk to you, like personism, right? Like Frank O'Hara's manifesto is like, rather than make a phone call to you, or I can't make a phone call to you, so I'll write a poem. Or like I was going to write a poem to you, but I'll just call you instead. The poem is almost like making a phone call. It's almost like writing a letter. It's a direct statement. It's chatty, it's gossipy. Here's what I did today. It's kind of throwaway. You know, a lot of Frank O'Hara, he would write at like a party or something. People would be talking to him and he'd write a poem, or he'd be watching TV, somebody be talking to him. I think that's a big part of New York School, is like recording what's around you and just recording the moment. You know, I think that's one reason why it was so prescient and so ahead of its time, and how it kind of predicted like our modern culture and our modern. That's why it feels like it applies to the modern moment so well, because it it's jump cutting, it's short attention span, it's funny, it's pithy, it's modern, it's witty, but it's also like uh it's like TV, it's musical, it's, you know, there's modern references in it. I think that I find that stuff fun. In a certain way, that's like my poetry has become just that. Just like references and like, I don't know, kind of the time sensitive material. In a certain way, I find that it just like warehousing that, the specificity of that, you know? Um, God damn. You know, publishing each other's books, publishing your own books. An aleatory kind of dreaminess there is to a lot of it. Uh, to be honest, like, there are a lot of things that I learned from New York School, and I was kind of like more deeply embedded in it, I would say, in like 2015, 16, 17, 18. I sort of like, because when I got into my relationship, that's when I started to sort of look more, because she was from San Francisco, so we went to San Francisco and he went to the West Coast. So I started to read those writers of San Francisco Renaissance, Philip Whalen, or like language poets, like I said, or I got more into the beat thing as well, in that sort of like moment before the New York School. Like I said, Joel Oppenheimer or Paul Blackburn, people like that kind of became more interesting to me, or I don't know, just kind of like my stuff started to be a little more influenced by that, I guess. John Giorno maybe became more of an influence, or like people I read in LA. I mean, Harry Northup, there's a poet in LA, and there's this kind of collective that has this thing called Cahuenga Press. They have certain affinities with the New York School. Harry Northup is an actor. He's in Taxi Driver, and he's in a few of Scorsese's like early films. He's in Mean Streets, but he's also an excellent, excellent poet. And so he lived in New York kind of like in the 60s, and then he moved to LA in the 70s. And his poems kind of have a little bit of a New York School, because like they're about real life and like just what happened to him in that day, you know. But he has this excellent book called East Hollywood or Memorial to Reason. And he has this whole sequence where he comes to New York to shoot a movie. He shoots this Jonathan Demme movie. I think the remake of The Manchurian Candidate. He plays John Kerry. He plays like a character based on John Kerry. And so they shot in Midtown. And so the poems are all like about his shooting this film in Midtown, and like him walking around Midtown and kind of remembering uh, what it was like in the 60s and taking acting classes and where he lived. And so he's mentioning all this shit by name. I lived on 10th and 25th, and I went to fucking Lee Strasberg's acting class at Carnegie Hall and this and that. And so it's like it's very New York School in certain ways. It's not maybe as funny or as like jovial or something. It's kind of a little more low key and like I don't know, deadpan or something. Dead. It's like a little. The pulse is kind of like a little more lower. Uh, but